Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Andrea with Adirondack Health Institute. Thank you for joining us today for the 2022 North Country Leadership Summit, Optimizing Healthcare, Community Resiliency, Collaboration, and Community Collaboration and Workforce Resiliency. This is the first day of the 2022 Summit and our third presentation of the day. I just want to go through a few things before we get started. First, want to thank all of our wonderful sponsors who have made this event possible. And a few housekeeping items. Please place all of your questions and comments in the chat, and staff will ensure that your questions are answered during the Q&A portion. All attendees, we're asking that you remain muted with your videos off during the presentation to support broadband connectivity. And all presentations are recorded and will be archived on the North Country Leadership Summit webpage. Now I'd like to introduce to you our speaker today, Abby Waters with PeopleScience Solutions.
Thank you, Andrea. It's a pleasure to be here today with all of you. And the topic that I will be sharing will be going along with the theme of your conference and how to build a resilient workforce. Specifically, we are going to be looking at how to integrate the science of EQ or emotional intelligence into the workplace for greater workplace agility. So my name is Abby Waters. I do work as an employee retention consultant and trainer at PeopleScience Solutions. You can find me on LinkedIn, or this is my Gmail account if you have any questions or feedback after the session today, or if you just need additional resources or book ideas, I'm happy to provide that as well. So I'd like to begin by sharing some statistics with you. Part of my job is to look at employee data from around the globe. And recently, our workplace development status from Gallup, the 22 report, says that 40% of employees experienced a lot of daily stress in the previous day. Almost half of the world's workers felt the burden of stress, especially women who work in the United States and Canada are among the most stressed employees globally. So well-being and engagement are directly tied to stress and directly tied to each other in powerful ways. When employees are engaged and thriving, it's noted that they experience significant problems less, such as anger, health problems, and the more engaged employees are in their job or at work, the better the financial industry or around the global economy is affected. So we want employees to have this continuum of health inside and outside of work. This is how people thrive, and this is how they increase their productivity and lower their stress in their job. So what we're looking at for the state of the workforce globally, not just in healthcare alone, but globally, is that organizations need to start thinking about the whole person and not just the worker. And so that's why we're going to implement one science today that's going to address a whole person. Part of how people are hired in our country is usually they're hired for intellect, they're hired for their experiences or their educational background or training background. So as you can see in this graphic, we have 3 gray triangles, and that's typically what people are hired for. But the employee experience is so much more than just these 3 categories. We need to incorporate the rest of these green stars into the employee experience in order to address the whole person and not just the worker. So we look at sciences around acumen and behavior, competencies and talents and skills to help people kind of move into their top core talents and flourish. We look at employee motivation. And then the one science that we're going to address today is right in the middle of this graphic, and that is EQ or emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence in the workplace is so important. Oftentimes, this is the cause for why people leave their jobs or they have issues with team building or trust, or have issues during times that require resiliency or change. So this is one of the main core reasons why people's careers are derailed or something becomes satisfactory to them, unsatisfactory to them over time. And this study was put out by the Center for Creative Leadership. And so we know that emotional competencies are extremely important to career development and career stability. On another note, we also know that the science of emotional intelligence is important for impacting company revenue or organizational revenue, whether it's a nonprofit organization or a for-profit organization. This study that we're looking at here revealed that only 15% of the bottom line was due to technical ability or competencies related to skills. So in other words, 85% of companies that participated in this study, they noted that their financial success was due to this ability to understand themselves in the workplace, these human engineering skills. How well do people understand their personality style? How well do they communicate with each other on a daily basis or negotiate conflict? And what about their leadership development skills? So technical abilities and IQ is very important, but it's not really the defining factor for individual success or company success. So these skills that we're going to talk about today are actually in demand. I was talking to one CEO last week, and she said they've had 10 interviews for a top position in their company. However, they don't feel like they are finding a fit according to an emotional intelligence standpoint. So we know that the future of EQ is everything. These are within the top 10 skills that people want right now, is highly emotionally intelligent workers, whether you work remotely, hybrid, or in person. These skills are absolutely necessary. So the definition of emotional intelligence, if you are new to the science or if you are familiar with it and you just are looking for a refresher today, it's this ability that we have to sense, understand, and effectively apply the power of acumen of emotions. Why? Because we want to facilitate higher levels of collaboration and productivity in the workplace. Much of the research that I will be highlighting today in this presentation has been framed around this work from Daniel Goldman. You can follow him on LinkedIn or look up his information later on, but he is sort of the modern father of EQ, if you will. And he's led this way for us to develop these domains, especially these 5 domains that I'm going to highlight about our intelligence and performance related to the science of self and the science of other people. So he's developed more than 5 domains. I think he's up to 14 or 15 perhaps now, but it becomes really difficult to talk about that many domains in a 1-hour session. So I thought I would just pick out 5 today that would help us have a refresher or maybe give us some new information as to why this is so important. So I'm going to share a clip with you from Daniel and his work. And the title of the clip is Why IQ Isn't Everything.
Since I started writing about and researching emotional intelligence in business, I found that the data in support of it has only gotten stronger. I saw recently a study, this surprised me, engineers, software coders and so on, were evaluated by their peers, people who work with them day in to day, on how successful they were at what they do. This turns out to be one of the strongest predictors of success in any field. And that was correlated with their IQ on one hand and their emotional intelligence on the other. And when I say emotional intelligence, they were evaluated on a 360 that looks at all 12 of the key emotional intelligence competencies and that distinguish star performers from average. The surprise was this: IQ correlated zero with their success as rated by peers. Emotional intelligence correlated very, very highly. Well, why would that be? Well, consider this. In order to be an engineer, you have to have an IQ about a standard deviation or more above average. That's an IQ of about 115 or so. And another recent paper shows that there's no relationship between career success and an IQ above 120. The reason is this: there is a strong floor effect for IQ in any role. All engineers have an IQ of 115 or more. So the range of variance is very reduced for IQ and success. Emotional intelligence, however, varies radically. So emotional intelligence means how well you manage yourself. Can you work toward your goals despite obstacles? Do you give up too soon? Do you have a negative outlook or a positive outlook? These are all emotional intelligence competencies that matter for success. Then there's the relationship competencies. Can you tune into other people? Do you notice other people? I remember hearing about two MIT grads who went into a giant tech company. One of them went around to other members of her team and asked, "What are you doing? How can I help?" The other stayed in his office and wrote code all day. And it's very clear who was going to get ahead. It was the one who wanted to be a team player. You don't write code in isolation anymore. Everyone works on projects together. You may write the code, but you have to coordinate, you have to influence, you have to persuade, you have to be a good team member. All of those are emotional intelligence competencies that distinguish outstanding from average performers. So when you think about it that way, it makes sense that even among engineers, emotional intelligence will predict who is a star and who's just mediocre. And when you think about this at the organizational level, it means you want to be sure to include emotional intelligence when you consider hiring people. I have a friend at an executive recruiting company specializes in C-level hires, CEOs, CFOs, and so on. And they once did a study internally of people they had recommended who turned out to be bad and were so bad they were fired. So these were failures. They were surprised to have failures, but they realized when they looked more carefully that these were people who were hired because of business expertise and IQ and fired because of a deficiency in emotional intelligence. So it's more important than ever these days. And so in hiring, it needs to be considered. In promoting people, of course it needs to be considered. And it should be part of HR. It should be what you help people develop further strengths in. Because the good news about emotional intelligence is it's learned and learnable. And you can upgrade it at any point in life if you're motivated.
So the exciting thing about this science, if you caught it at the end of the clip, is that this can be learned and developed throughout life. So this is coachable in your employees, and it's highly coachable in yourself if you're somebody who wants to grow and develop yourself as a leader. So we're going to look at these 5 domains quickly in this 1 hour that we have. And I'm going to go through and talk a little bit about each domain and maybe a few strategies to kind of grow and develop these areas. Of course, just like IQ can be measured, we can measure EQ, and we do this with reliable data assessment tools to help people understand where they're at in these domains and how they can grow. Emotional intelligence is directly tied to employee retention. If leaders and CEOs and directors are willing to work on this themselves, kind of has this trickle or this ripple effect. And then it becomes sort of this norm within employee culture that we're all working on these areas ourselves. So it has a direct correlation with how well people maintain or retain employees. One of the key things that people are surprised to find out about the science of emotional intelligence is that even though we are highly logical creatures, in our brain, emotion actually precedes logic. So before we have an intellectual response to a person or a situation, we first have an emotional response. We either feel positive towards something and attracted to it, or we feel negative and want to avoid or change it. So it's very basic. So for example, my 10-year-old son is in school, obviously, and I said, "What is your favorite subject in school this year?" And he said, "Well, I really like history because the teacher is very calm and he gives clear directions, and his classroom makes me feel calm." I said, "Oh, well, that's very interesting." So he felt positive towards it emotionally. And then I said, "What subject do you dislike the most?" And he said, "Math, because the teacher is very strict and she's very harsh." So we can go through this in our life as an adult. We can feel this way about a certain task in our work or a certain person in our environment. We know whether we're positively attracted to something or we feel negative and we want to avoid or change it. So emotions are powerful because they actually precede logic in the brain and in the body. The first domain I want to talk about is self-awareness. And this is perhaps the most crucial domain in all of emotional intelligence. This is your ability to recognize and understand your moods, emotions, and drives. Research shows us that 95% of us think that we are self-aware when only 15% of us actually are. Again, why it's such a crucial domain, because we think we have self-awareness when actually most of us don't possess high levels of it like we think we do. This is perhaps the foundation for healthy leadership. If I'm not aware of my emotions, moods, or drives, if I'm not connected to myself, I can't really connect to other human beings. So the key is check in often with self. This is something that you can set on your phone or on your computer. You can set EQ check-ins and set off like an alarm or something to go with it, and just practice this. I'm thinking of researcher Brene Brown out of the University of Houston, and one of her studies surveyed over 7,000 people, and 7,000 people could only name three core emotions: angry, happy, and sad. And so if you think about that, there's so much more when it comes to angry, happy, and sad. And we also absorb these emotions physiologically in our body. So we can think about, how am I really feeling? And then where do I feel this emotion in my body? This leads to greater self-awareness. So again, apart from those three things that over 7,000 people could list in the category of emotions, it's often helpful to look at something like an emotions wheel. And while you think this might be helpful for children, this is actually really helpful for adults, because what we're finding in the study of emotions and self-awareness is that we just don't have the vocabulary for how we actually feel or where we feel it in our body. And so it leads to this disconnect where we're not really self-aware. In the category of self-awareness, we have two different kinds of ways that we can be self-aware. Internal self-awareness is an inward understanding of my values, my passions, my strengths and aspirations. And so if employees know these things about themselves, you can imagine that they're highly motivated, right? They're very tuned into their work. External self-awareness is just as equally important. It's about understanding how other people see me and being willing to accept feedback in my employee environment and being willing to understand what my weaknesses or my blind spots are. So again, what are my values and motives? What are my strengths? And what value do I bring to this organization? And one of the employee assessments that I use on a frequent basis, there's a section in the assessment that's labeled value to the organization. And this verbiage is helpful in self-awareness. It's getting to know what I bring to the table. And then external self-awareness, asking other people, what do you think that I'm doing that's helping contribute to this team or organization? Or perhaps it's something negative. Am I wasting time? Am I wasting resources? What am I doing that's detracting from our success as an organization? What could I be doing better? Could I improve myself? And then another powerful question to ask is, how do people perceive me during times of stress? So when we're looking at organizational resiliency and we're looking at lowering employee stress, each employee needs to be responsible to ask themselves, what is the source or main sources of my stress? And then how am I coming across to other people during these times of stress? Self-awareness. What does this look like? And how does this affect other people? So just a few tips for learning how to increase this in yourself. Pay attention to mood and behavior throughout the day. Again, setting those EQ reminders on your phone. You can do it at 8 a.m., 2 p.m., 6 p.m. Just set a little quick 3-minute reminder and kind of check in. Maybe ask yourself at the end of the day, what went well and what didn't go well. You can try journaling in the evening before bed. This is when your limbic system is most calm. Early in the morning, this is when we're kind of getting up and getting moving in the day. It's not the best time for reflection, so we want to do when our body is calm. Again, asking people those powerful questions about strengths and weaknesses. If I really want to grow and develop as an employee or a leader, what can I do to improve? Or what should I do more of because it energizes me versus stresses me out? And then taking evidence-based assessments, using tools to help start that conversation and have powerful questions with self and with each other. So that essentially is self-awareness. And it's really the foundational layer for how we look at the other domains in EQ. Because if we're not aware of our own emotions or how they impact other people, it really becomes difficult to demonstrate the other domains. And the next domain we're going to talk about is self-regulation. So it's impossible, essentially, to regulate emotions if we are unaware of them. Now, self-regulation is your ability to control or redirect a disruptive impulse or mood. It's this phrase that you've heard, think before you act. And it can be very difficult to do if you're running in high states of stress or if you're simply on autopilot. So this can show up in the workplace as over speaking, interrupting people in a meeting. This can look like sending out a passive aggressive email or an aggressive email when you were kind of in a heightened state, fight, flight, fear, or anxiety yourself. This can look like making hasty decisions and not taking time to analyze the data. There's lots of things that can get the best of us when it comes to judgment and self-control. And so people take note of people who are highly self-regulated in the workplace. It's very attractive skill. So checking in communication-wise, this is where it really shows up in leadership development and in teams. Communicating, again, out of emotions that I'm not aware of, sometimes being controlling or micromanaging in the workplace, can really project that onto other employees and really set your team up for failure. Or if you have an aggressive manager or an aggressive employee, it might come out with anger. So also making sure that you speak to people, go directly to them if you have an issue with them. Again, workplace trust is highly inhibited if we have cultures of gossip or slander. So we want to make sure that we're being direct in how we communicate with people. So assertive behavior is best. Practicing direct, thoughtful communication is usually the best way to build trust and build influence with teams and among people. So what happens on a neurological level is the strong emotion or that poor self-regulation comes out when we were hoping for a different outcome. Remember that slide a few slides back that said emotion precedes logic? So this is when your brain hasn't had time to go through logic and it just goes straight to emotion. This happens in the limbic system. This is your center for fight, flight, fawn, freeze, all these stress postures that commonly happen on a moment by moment or daily basis. As opposed to the prefrontal cortex, which is where we see executive planning, functioning, logic happening in the brain. So again, this is hitting your limbic system, the self-regulation center. Now I'm going to share a clip about Daniel Goldman talking about what happens in the brain neurologically and how the amygdala, which is right between the ears, actually gets hijacked, and that's what causes the issues with self-regulation.
And here, this is a really simplistic heuristic. Basically, it's talking about the executive center, which is in the prefrontal area of the brain, just behind the forehead. It's a series of networks, really, that connect throughout the brain. And then there's the emotional center, between the ears, roughly. And particularly, I'd like to call attention to the amygdala. The amygdala is one of the parts of the brain that has more connections to every other part than any other area of the brain. So the emotional circuitry, the emotional networks, and the executive centers do a dance all day long. And this has to do with emotional intelligence. The brain in prehistory didn't have a prefrontal cortex. That was like an add-on, like brain 2.1. That was oh yeah, this helps. The reason it helps is we manage our emotions from there. But the amygdala is the alarm center. It's the brain's radar for threat. Right now, the amygdala of everyone in this room is asking a question it's asked through human history. And the question is, am I safe? If the answer is yes, then fine. If the answer is no, if the amygdala perceives a threat, then it has a privileged position in the brain. It can hijack the rest of the brain and drive it in a way that it thinks is essential to survival. This worked really well in the Pleistocene age. It was dynamite. Oh, there's something that's going to eat us, we better run, and we better do it instantly. Or there's something we eat, we better run after it. We better do it quickly. However, today, the amygdala is navigating a complex symbolic reality, civilization, and there are some problems. One problem is the amygdala has a very special position. It has a 1 neuron long connection to the brain, to the ear and the eye in the brain, which means it's very quick in brain time. But how many of you remember a day when television had something called static? That's what it sees. It has a fuzzy picture because most information actually goes to other parts of the brain. So the amygdala always also has a decision rule, which is I'd rather be safe than sorry. It's got a hair trigger. And the other thing is the fuzzy picture and the hair trigger mean it can make mistakes. There are 3 signs of a mistake, I'll call it an amygdala hijack. One is you have a very sudden negative emotional reaction. The second, it's very strong. I'm really angry. I'm really anxious. I'm fearful. And the third is you do something that afterwards you really regret. Like, why did I say that? Why did I do that? That's because the amygdala falls back on overlearned reactions. In a split second, it does something that it sure will work, but it does not always work.
So as you can see, there are mistakes that are made, and we have this emotional hijacking that takes over in our brain and in our body. So emotional hijacking is when our emotions are elevated, where we are no longer thinking rationally, and that logic has gone completely out the window. So these are the times where we are making the mistake in the workplace. Hasty decisions, again, poor communication, not taking time to evaluate our self-awareness before we act. So I like to use this example of the glass concept method. And this is a way that you can even print this out and put it by your computer at work, or if you like to draw, you can draw little glasses and kind of color them in. But the glass concept helps us understand self-regulation. And if our glass is clear, that little clear glass in the middle, it means that we are not elevated and we're not experiencing any significant emotions that would impede us from making a mistake. So I'm clear, I'm logical, I'm balanced, I'm able to communicate and make decisions. To the left of that glass, if I have a cloudy glass, it means I'm starting to experience some emotional discomfort. I'm triggered in some way. My stress level might be starting to rise. This is the time to get back down to that clear glass. So taking a walk, taking a break, shutting your screen, not answering a text or an email, giving yourself permission to tune into that self-awareness before you proceed. The red glass is where we've kind of made that mistake. It's out the window, right? We've cut somebody off in traffic, or we've snapped at our spouse, or something happens in the workplace, right? So we want to kind of use this glass method to gauge where we're at, again, with those EQ check-in or reminders. So the amygdala hijack is very powerful indeed. So we practice things like pausing, identifying, checking in, and not responding until we're in a good space. And when you improve self-regulation, again, it really shows up in the workplace as a great leadership skill. This helps people become more adaptable and flexible during stress, because that old programming isn't always getting tripped up in the brain of going into a stress posture. This helps people understand triggers or impulses, and helps you to verbalize or express emotions in a clear, calm manner, and then manage that stress level with greater consistency. So now we're going to move into the science of others. So those two domains were about us, right? Individual responsibility for self-awareness and self-regulation skills in the workplace. But it doesn't go, it doesn't stop there. It goes farther, where we have to cross into how do we work well with other people. And that is these two domains about social awareness and social regulation skills. And social awareness is our ability to understand the emotional makeup of other people. In other words, can I read emotion in other people? To some extent, it might not be perfect and we might not always get it right, but are we tuning into them at least? Are we just thinking about ourselves, or are we able to build rapport and work well with others? So I like to use this illustration of an emotional speedometer. If I'm going to implement a new medical software system, but my team is in the red zone where they're burnt out, unhappy, employee engagement is low, this is not the time that I'm going to make a big change in the organization. If my team is somewhere in the yellow zone and maybe they're kind of like, I think we're okay, our engagement's decent, but maybe there's some things that we can improve before we implement a new strategic plan or implement something new, then I'm going to work on gauging that as a leader or as a director. If I'm in the green zone with my employees and engagement's really high, retention is really high, these are great opportunities to make organizational changes and to keep building on that momentum. So basically knowing how to read the room, knowing where your people are at, knowing where your organization is at is going to really help in the science of social awareness. So of course, we all know the buzzword empathy, and we want more empathy in the workplace. Empathy builds connection, it builds trust in teams. The opposite of that is disconnection. And so if we don't listen to people's stories and if we don't believe their stories, we're already going to automatically have disconnection. So I'm going to share a clip from Daniel. He talks a little bit about 3 different kinds of empathy, which I think you'll find interesting.
You know, there are 3 kinds of empathy. This really opened my eyes.
I didn't know
a
it
little
till I
more.
read it here. But
Yeah, right.
there are three
Well,
kinds of empathy.
Yeah, one is cognitive empathy. That means I understand how you see things, what your perspective is. You know that old saying, walk a mile and the other person shoot. Technically, it means I know what mental models you have. I know what language to use, so you'll understand me.
Yeah.
So that's one complete set, and it operates in one part of the brain.
And almost impossible to be truly successful in the world without some of that.
Exactly.
Isn't
You've got
it?
to have that. You've got to have that.
Yeah. And lots of people have bosses who are not.
Absolutely.
Or managers who are not.
Yeah, or spouses.
Or spouses who are not, which
Exactly.
makes for poor connection and bad
poor
relationship.
communication and a lot of problems like at work. The second kind is it's a different part of the brain. It's the social brain, we call it, and that's sensing in yourself immediately what the other person is feeling. That means rapport. And you're only going to have rapport if you pay full attention to the other person. You're going to have chemistry,
right?
If both of you are paying attention. And if you're not, you're distracted. Oh, I'm checking my thing. Not going to happen. So there's this emotional empathy. The third kind is very important and it's underrated. It's called empathic concern. It means if I have someone in my life who's in distress, I'm not just going to feel it. I'm going to want to help them because I love them. It draws on a third part of the brain, which is we call it the ancient mammalian system for parenting.
Yeah.
It's like a parent's love for a child. If you have that love for someone, then you're going to be there for them. And that's a different kind. It's different than cognitive, different than emotional.
And so the self-awareness, the ability to manage your emotions, having empathy also leads to the next thing, and that is having great relationships. I mean, automatically,
you put it all together.
Yeah, if you do those three things, you're going to have a better relationship.
Think about it. If you're out of control, you can't manage yourself. You're going to have a terrible relationship. If you don't tune in, you don't know what's going on with the person, you're going to be off. So you need to have all of those three to have a good interaction. There are three kinds of empathy.
So we have to have empathy in the workplace. It's not enough just to say we're an empathetic workplace. We actually have to go beyond that and demonstrate it. And employees will not work for managers that are unempathetic. It just really drives retention rates down or increases them actually. So we really need to have this science in the workplace implemented on a frequent basis, especially when it comes to emotional resiliency. The second part of this is how we regulate this. So it's not enough just to notice people, but we must build rapport and we must build connection. I was speaking to a manager this last week who manages a very large ophthalmology department. And the difference between her and another manager, they were trying to figure out, why does this person manage everyone so well in the same job, but this person doesn't? And the difference was that the manager that was successful, she kept a notebook about all her employees, and she knew, when their birthday was, what day their child was going to camp. She just knew things about them, and she didn't micromanage them. She just had a relationship with them. And so it really was the key factor when they figured out why is this person so successful? Because she really cared about her employees, and the employees felt valued. It was about that relationship aspect. And so if you're missing that in your department or in your teams, it's something you can't really go without for very long. It'll start to show up quite a bit. So when you have your next social interaction, think about these steps: listening to people, reflecting back what you hear, validating or affirming what they said, asking follow-up questions. I mean, part of the self-awareness piece is not being self-absorbed, is asking other people about themselves. If you want to influence people in the workplace, if you want to be a great leader, get to know people and listen to them. Believe their story. Believe what they tell you. It's not just being enough to be empathetic. It's saying, I believe you and I want to support you. That really drives connection and fosters healthy teams. So here's some strategies. If this is a domain that you struggle with, especially if you're working virtually, it can be very difficult to kind of cultivate social awareness and social regulation. You have to get really creative about it, but you can do it. If there's a misunderstanding on a team, the person who takes responsibility and makes amends, even if you kind of lost a little trust along the way, this will build trust back up. Okay, instead of blaming other people or blaming a process or a system, just say, I'm sorry for this, and take responsibility in it. This is really helpful in forging connections. allowing other people to take the lead, because if you're not allowing other people to flourish with their strengths and you're always kind of dominating that situation, you'll never know what your team is capable of. Not micromanaging people. That's a common complaint that I hear that really breaks down trust in teams. Not blaming or holding grudges against one another. And then asking people to share their stories, getting to know them as a person, what their likes and dislikes are, what their employee talents are. And then our last category that kind of directly ties back into self-awareness is motivation. Again, if you're not self-aware and you don't know what your passions and strengths and ambitions are, it's going to be hard to be motivated, right? I was just talking last week to a large public health department here in the Midwest, and I was sharing a concept about motivation. And motivation does not have or does not keep any company with cynicism. And so if you're trying to be a motivated person, but your environment is cynical, or the people you try to tell about your passions, they're cynical towards you, it won't go hand in hand. Or if you're cynical yourself, it just really doesn't exist together. You have to kind of be that person that goes for it no matter what. So it goes beyond money and recognition. So the old way of work was we reward employees for salary and insurance benefits. Well, now we're finding that even in amongst Gen Z workers, the recent data shows us that they care deeply about job stability, feeling valued in the workplace, and making sure that mental health is addressed in the workplace. And so that goes beyond paycheck and benefits, right? So we have to get creative in how we understand motivation in the workplace. One of the ways you do that, if you don't have a motivated employee, is you sit down and have a conversation with them, or you use some tools to find out what they're motivated by, and then you follow up that way. So here's Daniel on how to motivate a demotivated person.
Related to this, a sort of sister topic is motivation. What makes somebody motivated? And if they're constantly stressed, they're not going to be in a motivated state. And some leaders obviously have people that are low skill and demotivated, and they should probably get moved on. But you've also got other highly talented people that are demotivated. So if a leader sees that in a member of their team, what advice would you?
Well, I would start with, what does this person really want? I'd have a one-on-one conversation. What do you want from your life? What do you want from your career? What do you want from this job? What is it about this job that might be exciting or engaging? How could I, as a manager, help this person have assignments, for example, that will help them develop skills for where they want to go in life? In other words, you engage. You start by seeing what's meaningful for the person.
Okay, and it goes back to something else you were saying about heart to heart, having a heart-to-heart conversation and tapping into their emotion.
And by the way, this conversation is not about the job; it's about the person.
Yeah.
So it is very much heart to heart.
Yeah, exactly. And making sure what they're doing now is aligning with their
where they want to go, or how can you move things a bit so that it's closer to where they want to go. Yeah.
So it's really about the person. Again, going back to this concept of whole person and not just worker. So what we're really seeing needs to happen organizationally is managers, directors, CEOs, they maybe think they don't have the time for it, but they almost have to become experts in employee development and coaching. And it's kind of becoming this necessary thing in order to keep and build great teams for the long haul. So questions, if you're having trouble with motivation yourself, here are a few questions you can ask yourself, or questions you can ask a demotivated employee to kind of figure out what's going on. Why is the engagement low and why is the motivation low? And kind of try to foster that bridge between self-awareness and motivation. And so again, it's all about asking powerful questions, especially when we're talking to employees, building relationships with them, helping them work on their self-awareness, and kind of coaching them through these different concepts. If you are a reader, These are a few books that you can reference if you are interested in more of this topic. Obviously, this quick session is not enough time. We just scratched the surface of a few basic concepts here. And so the Emotional Intelligence Quick Book by Travis Bradbury and Jean Greaves is a very easy read, especially if this information is new or maybe you'd like some of your employees to read it. And then, of course, Daniel's book is really powerful, Why EQ Matters More Than IQ. I have a couple companies right now that I work with that are reading this book and kind of doing employee book clubs. But this is a very nice way to cultivate self-awareness and to start thinking of becoming more of a trauma-informed organization, if that's in your strategic plan, how to help recognize these things in ourselves and then in other employees and do some of our own self-work. So this is a very good book for employee book clubs if your company's into that sort of thing. And I would like to leave a few minutes here, 10 minutes or so, if there's any questions or comments. We certainly want people to feel like they can, dialogue about this with each other if they feel comfortable to turn their cameras on and unmute. But if you have questions or feedback, you can email me anytime, and I would be happy to get you some more resources or just any other book ideas if you're curious about learning more about this topic. And I appreciate your attention today as well.
Thank you so much, Abby. This was a really insightful presentation. I think it probably got a lot of people really thinking. Looks like we have one question. Yes, all of the presentations during Summit are recorded and will be archived on the AHI Summit webpage, so the slides will be available. Do we have any other questions? And you can feel free to put your questions in the chat box or to unmute yourselves and speak directly. It looks like we do have a question that came through. Is there anything people have brought to this approach that takes into account people with disorders or disabilities that result in difficulty acquiring aspects of emotional intelligence, social awareness, cognitive empathy, external self-awareness, etc.? Are there strategies that keep us in mind, or more importantly, strategies to teach peers and leaders how to recognize and accommodate us? Abby, would you like to answer that?
Sure, absolutely. That's a great question and a very forward-thinking question. I think when it comes to social and conversational intelligence, we should always be aware of maybe people who do struggle with these types of skills. I would say the first place to start is, again, cultivating that internal self-awareness to sort of know how to be connected to yourself first. And then out of that, looking how you can connect with other people and have that social awareness of maybe this doesn't come easy to them. Maybe they struggle with eye contact. Maybe they have social anxiety. Maybe after the pandemic, social awareness and social regulation went down because of a lot of isolation that happened in workplaces. So yes, keep in mind that your foremost job is to work on self-awareness yourself, and then to have openness to that concept too. So if it's something that you're struggling with in your workplace, it would be really healthy to have a conversation about it. If you have a trusting workplace where you can talk about that. And, keep in mind that the more self-aware you become, the more you will pick up on, do other people struggle with these things? And how can I have compassion for that or empathy for that? A lot of people are stuck in trauma postures and states that disconnect them socially from other people. So reading more books about that, being trauma informed, how to recognize that in other people so that you can support that. Very good question.
Thank you. And do we have any other questions? So again, Abby did provide her email address. And Abby, I don't know if you want to pop your email into the chat if anyone didn't have a chance to write it down. But you can feel free to follow up with Abby if you do have questions that you think of after we leave today. Thank you. Abby's email is in the chat now. Any other questions? Does anyone want to unmute themselves and ask a question directly? I'll just give a few moments if anybody would like to do that.
Hi, this is Barbara Salcedo. Thank you for the presentation. Love the content. So I have someone that reports to me who comes across as being very unapproachable. He seems to get along very well with people in his own age group. When you talk with him or over the phone or in person, he tends to give very either monosyllabic responses, or I mean, if you get like 2 words out of him, that's a lot. Recently, there was a phone exchange between him and my boss, who's a chief at my community health center, where she was asking him, because it just seemed at the time easier just to pick up the phone and ask him, when was your hiring date? And he responded with, why are you asking? Why do you need to know that? Now, my boss is very easygoing, and she said, you know, she did not mind the question, it's the tone. So when I have weekly check-ins, individual one-on-ones with all of my staff for the similar reasons that we talk about here. Check in, see how things are going, if I can be of service, and going over any documents that they'd be working on, to work on projects, anything like professional development opportunities, you name it. We try to do some things during that hour, and I really do stress that my role here at this organization is to support and guide them, right? My success hinges on their success, if you will. So, yeah. He then answered that he has learned that when he's on the phone, he comes across very in the manner very unapproachable. Once some time ago in the past, he did try to change to sound more approachable, but he realized that he wasn't going to do it anymore, and that it is what it is, and that he's not going to change. And so I told him, because he's a project manager, I recommended to him that to reconsider his decision about how his stance around how people receive his tone and his approach, because it's hard to be a successful project manager if you are not coming across as an approachable person, right? And he said, nope, I'm not going to, I already made a decision, I'm not going to change for anyone.
Yeah,
I have nothing else to say.
Yeah, I think, I think if you've tried to have a crucial conversation multiple times, if multiple people engage this employee, one of the things I encourage managers and directors to look for is, are people coachable? So if a very bold statement is, I'm not willing to work on my behavior or how I come across to clients or to other employees, especially when I'm in a leadership role or a customer service role, I think one of the main things we're afraid of is to hire and fire against EQ. It's one of those things where if you want your culture